Hi, I'm Maggie McGrath, the editor of Forbes Women, and today we are talking about a decision out of the Alabama Supreme Court that says that frozen embryos are in fact children. Here to break this down for us is Harry Nelson. He's a lawyer and the founder of the largest healthcare-focused law firm in Los Angeles. Harry, thanks so much for joining us. This case has been fascinating. I've already been in 10 conversations with different women about it. I think everyone wants to know what's going on. But for those who are not following the ins and outs of the Alabama Supreme Court, can you explain to us what this ruling is and how it came about?
Sure. So what happened here is that two couples who had used a fertility clinic in Alabama for in vitro fertilization IVF services had stored embryos that were being stored in a freezer in the embryo lab at this fertility center. And apparently it seems that a patient, somebody else who was in the facility at some point, went into an unauthorized area, went into the embryo lab, and they were able to open the freezer, and they took out a tray that contained the embryos of these two couples. And apparently it was so cold from the freezer that it gave them an immediate freezer burn. They dropped it on the ground, and the embryos were destroyed in that process. And so these two families both brought lawsuit together against the fertility clinic, making a claim under an Alabama law known as the Wrongful Death to Minors Act, essentially claiming that they had lost children, that their children had been killed, effectively equivalent of involuntary manslaughter in a civil damages case against the fertility center. So that was what was at stake. And the lower courts said, no, this law doesn't apply. There's a big difference between the death of a minor, a child, or an infant, and an embryo. But the Supreme Court of Alabama disagreed and said this is absolutely a life equivalent to a child. The fact that it was, in the words of the court, extrauterine, meaning that it was not born, it was not in a uterus, it was not developed into any level of fetal development beyond a few days, which is what the fertility centers had claimed, was sufficient to make it a life. So this is a really radical decision. It's the first time an American court, a Supreme Court in any state, has taken the position that an embryo is no different than a life. It has profound implication, right? Alabama already is one of these zero abortion states, completely restricting abortion. But now that decision has made a logical extension into the whole world of fertility. So it's questionable whether fertility doctors will want to or feel comfortable to continue to practice, because it has all kinds of implications for what you can and can't do with embryos and what risks doctors and patients may be under in this area.
I want to get into those implications, but the first question that comes to my mind is twofold. One of which is, did scientists or doctors testify during this process? Like, have we heard from the medical community about how they think of this ruling?
I believe in the lower courts there was testimony, there was medical testimony, I believe, to clarify, on that issue, but the courts basically stopped I believe it was submitted in affidavit form and there was never a trial in these cases, because the lower courts did not believe that you could have a wrongful death of a minor by an embryo. So we haven't gotten that far.
Okay, because my overarching question is this a politically motivated decision that we're seeing here?
Well, I think a lot of observers are thinking that while it is a tragedy, certainly any parent who is struggling with fertility issues and going to fertility clinics for in vitro fertilization obviously would experience a loss when you had these embryos. But to treat that loss as as equivalent to the death of a child does not seem to most observers like the reaction of that most parents would have, and it does seem like a calculated political choice to bring this case. There are a lot of people who believe, and you can count me among them, who believe that this case was brought to make a political point, and the Supreme Court of Alabama in some ways just made a logical move from its previous decisions, in the abortion space to fertility. And the question, of course, is how much. Not only what does that mean for fertility, but what does it mean for everything else? What does this mean for contraception, and how far are we going to go down this chain of treating embryos as life?
I was going to ask you those questions, but just to understand where we are in the legal process, is there a chance this gets repealed? Is there a chance this gets undone in some kind of way? And or will we see this at the Supreme Court level, the federal Supreme Court?
So it's a good question. There could be a petition for to ask the United States Supreme Court to hear this case. Certainly the Fertility Center has the right to petition the Supreme Court, and the question is whether it's going to be deemed worthwhile by whether there's a chance that the Supreme Court would hear this, and whether the Supreme Court would actually hear it. And I suspect that we will see a petition to the Supreme Court, but I have a feeling that the Supreme Court, that a majority of justices on the Supreme Court do not want to hear this case. That the only justices who would favor hearing a case like these are the ones who have taken more extreme positions, who are sort of, probably supportive privately of this decision. We just saw earlier this week that the Supreme Court declined to take a University of Virginia case on the area of affirmative action, where it looks like 6 of the 9 justices currently don't want to revisit an issue that they just did in the last term, where they already laid out some pretty clear standards on race-based college admissions and did not want to come back and turn back to the subject. And my suspicion is that the Supreme Court has no appetite to touch this. So I think that, practically speaking, this is the law of the land in Alabama, and anybody thinking about getting fertility services or providing them needs to treat this as sort of a final decision.
This is the law of the land in Alabama. What does this mean? Let's talk about the couples and people who have embryos currently on ice in Alabama. What should they do? Does this mean they need to immediately proceed with trying to have children, to use the embryos? Should they move the embryos to another state? And can they even move to another state? Or is that something that could be criminalized under this ruling?
Those are some great questions. My general feeling is that we haven't yet seen there's been a fear, and I share it, that we may see the end of fertility centers feeling comfortable to operate in Alabama. I'm confident that if it comes to that, if that does happen, there will be arrangements made for the safe transport of embryos. And so I don't think that any parents with embryos that are currently there need to take urgent action to move out of state. So I think there is time to see what's going to happen, and I think there will, under any circumstances, right? Frankly, think about it. If centers did not transport them safely, then they would be committing a widespread killing under the definition of this new law. And on your second question I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. I apologize.
Well, I guess if a couple is assessing their options, is it like, should they immediately
travel,
have kids?
right? You asked about the issue of travel.
Or should they immediately implant, or what should they?
Yeah,
how
so,
are they?
So I would say, look, on the issue of immediate decision, I think people have time to assess. Given that these embryos are given the sanctity of life, it's hard to imagine that people will be denied the opportunity or that there will be destruction. Just the opposite, right? The risks for the doctors involved would be something going wrong. So it may be that doctors will not want to handle them and be forced to transport them to another state. On the issue of travel is a really interesting issue. Alabama was one of the states that threatened, certain state officials threatened to prosecute women who traveled out of state for abortions. We've seen a hard pushback on that, and also it's very clear that the right to travel is a fundamental right that all Americans have, and that includes the right to travel for healthcare decisions. And I suspect that it appears that the threats being made by Alabama and other states, state officials in other states, to prosecute is really hollow. And that there really is it's outrageous that the people are being threatened in the abortion context for traveling to pursue their legal options elsewhere. And I think we're going to see the same. I expect the same here. Parents should not be afraid. But although this is the problem, we're going to see is that what's happening is a lot of cost is being imposed on these families. 1 in 6 families, trying to have children using fertility services is the number I saw. So this is a.
That was going to be my
Sorry.
follow-up question. If someone has not yet frozen their eggs or embryos but lives in Alabama, what's your advice legally for them? Should they even start the process in Alabama, or how do they make that decision under this new ruling?
I think it's a hard decision, and I think if people have the resources, to be the financial wherewithal to go to another state where this is not likely to be a controversial issue, this decision makes it a good one to go out of state and to just begin the process in a state where you don't have to worry about decisions like this coming out of the Supreme Court. So I think, unfortunately, there are going to be many Alabamans who don't have that choice, who don't have that luxury, and I think are going to be really have their options limited here and may be forced to figure out what's available. And that's just a sort of a sad feature of this decision.
Now, this ruling came down on Friday, so it's relatively new, but do we know anything about the enforcement mechanisms here? Because I was talking to our healthcare reporter about what if there's a natural disaster and a storage facility loses power? So in the case that was brought to the Alabama Supreme Court, it's these couples whose embryos were destroyed through human error. But what happens if a hurricane, a flood, a tornado comes through and there is damage to embryos? Is the storage facility liable? Is the couple liable? Do we even know the answers to these questions?
No, it's a great question. Look, we have a concept built into American law of what's called force majeure, or an act of God, that some parties are not responsible for. But I think your question raises a great point, which is, where is the line on negligence, right? Negligence is the theory in American law of what is a reasonable person or a reasonable business that's, for example, doing storage. What are they expected to do? And when did they fall below the standard of care that they're expected to meet and breach their obligations so that they're financially responsible for damages that they caused? So I think that is a real question, right? No one's going to be blamed if it's a freak occurrence where we can call it an act of God, but there are going to be plenty of things, plenty of cases where someone behaved negligently. I mean, and not to take this too far on an extreme, but I have the one question this raises for me relates to miscarriage, right? I mean, the question that we've had a whole conversation about the way that health systems, hospitals have changed the way they deliver miscarriage care because of the fear that a miscarriage may resemble or be close to an abortion. But I think this raises the question of whether women who are pregnant can engage in activity that endangers the pregnancy and is a basis for charges of manslaughter. That is a perfectly logical extension of this ruling and should give pause to anybody who is concerned about reproductive rights.
You mentioned contraception earlier, and I think I'm just going to mirror the question back to you. This ruling raises concerns over miscarriage, and to my mind, knowing how contraception works, does this threaten contraception in Alabama or in the United States more broadly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this decision today about the status of an embryo doesn't directly touch upon it, but it's very clear. We're already seeing evidence in not only in Alabama but in other abortion-restrictive states that healthcare providers, pharmacies are nervous, for example, about prescription drugs that can be given for contraception, for like and both before and after, about their implications, because effectively they may be denying a life from coming into existence, or in some cases with some of the medications that are taken, can be taken in the days after to avoid a pregnancy, would effectively be preventing it from occurring. And so this further bolsters the kind of legal foundation that needs to be made to make a move in that direction. And a lot of people, when Roe v. Wade was repealed, a lot of people insisted that we weren't going to see this taken. We had people who defended the decision and said, we don't have to worry about fertility rights, we don't have to worry about contraception, but I think we can see from today that we do have to worry about fertility rights, and we already are having to worry about contraception, and it's certainly not hard to imagine a decision after this one that takes the same kind of really extreme position on contraceptive medications and contraception.
Well, after all, how many years did we hear that Roe was settled law? And lo and behold, it was not. So would you say that those who are raising alarm bells that I hear a certain faction of society saying this is about controlling women and limiting women's choices. And then another faction of society says that's overreacting, that's, fear and just completely irrational. What do you say to those warring factions?
A lot of people complained that Roe v. Wade offended, it offended the sensibilities of people who believed in the sanctity of life, and that it was a trampling on their rights. And the worry on the other side of people who defended reproductive health access and the right to all of the rights around that, including abortion, worried that we would be in a world of chaos if you took them away. And I think we're seeing it play out. We're seeing that is playing out right now. We are literally, this couldn't be more chaotic for anyone who is considering or in the process of IVF or any other fertility, reproductive technology for trying to have a child. So we've created a world of chaos with this decision, supposedly throwing it back to the states. So it's not going to get easier from here. And the other thing that's really noteworthy is that the Supreme Court, when they issued the repeal in the Dobbs case, they made a statement that, we're leaving it to the states and everything's going to be, they sort of suggested everything's going to be calm at the national level, and this will just be dealt with from state to state. So if you don't like the way the law is running in Alabama, travel north, go to Illinois. And so what we're seeing is that this battle is just continuing to rage, and people are trying to push it back up to a national level. And frankly, it's going to be on the table in the campaign for the next president and the next Congress. And this issue is not settling down and becoming a sort of state by state issue. This is still just a raging debate that's going to keep expanding.
Well, there are so many ways to attack it. And I'm thinking also about stem cell research, which is another potential ramification here. Have you thought about what this ruling could mean for stem cell research, if not just in Alabama, in the United States more broadly?
No, it's a great point. It definitely raises more questions around any kind of fetal stem cell therapies. We've seen enormous advances in all kinds of areas, in wound care and all throughout, just really amazing things being done therapeutically with all kinds of stem cells, some of which are coming from amniotic material, cells, and some of which are coming, can be fetal stem cells in some cases. And we're really going to be again sort of stunting research and limiting options. And it's really this should be taken as a threat by anybody who's interested in the whole area of biologics. This is really kind of a profound new way of thinking biomedically about what an embryo represents.
Now, you said the Supreme Court seems unlikely to take a case up like this, but let's just say the unlikely case emerges and the Supreme Court does sit with something like this. How would you expect them to rule, and could this Alabama ruling somehow enter federal territory?
Look, I don't doubt that there are justices on the Supreme Court who agree with the point being made here, which is that from the moment of conception, a life exists. Whether there are 5 such justices on the Supreme Court is questionable. Right? No one really knows. We've moved to, for many years, John Roberts was kind of the center of the court for decision purposes, and seemed more concerned with stability in American law. And we now have the center of the court is Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Amy Coney Barrett, who are much more unknown. They've been on the court for a much shorter time. They appear to be more conservative, but I don't think anyone knows for certain how they would rule on this. And I think I'm convinced. The only thing I feel confident about saying is that if they have the opportunity to join Justice Roberts and the liberal justices in terms of taking and passing on hearing this case, they will jump at the opportunity to deny cert, as it's called, and decline to review the case, because I think it does push the issue further out and raise really troubling implications, as we're discussing today.
This might feel like a tangent, but I was talking to a lawyer about this. In a case of divorce, and if a couple has an embryo frozen, how is that decided? And does the law in the case of divorce see the embryo as property? And if yes, does that then challenge this ruling?
That's a great question. I do think that it is that in current law in most states, embryos are shared are property and shared custody of the couple, and it's a really good question what rights the parties have in the embryo. Frankly, it's not an issue that I've looked at before.
That's okay. I came here with a bevy of questions. You've answered a lot of them. And I think my final question to you is, we've talked about the implications on fertility care, on miscarriages, on contraception, on federal law. Is there an aspect of this case that the public and the media is not talking about that you would like to raise to our attention?
I think people should be. The one thing I'd say about this decision is, it's possible to view it really narrowly and say, oh, this was just a freak occurrence that happened when these embryos were, accidentally destroyed in the center, and this doesn't really have broad implications. But I think what's important to remember is, our whole system of medical training, of how we deliver care and offer care is already full of risk, right? Of malpractice risk. We have these, doctors who invest years and years of their life beyond what any other profession, certainly what lawyers like me invest to be able to do what they do. And when you create these extraordinary risks by taking novel and extreme positions on what is involved in handling an embryo, you've just taken something that was already challenging and expensive and difficult, even under the best circumstances, and you've now sort of pushed it over the edge. So if people think that this case is just an isolated, strange ruling that has no implications, I would challenge them to take a look at the sort of way that it reverberates out and think about the way that it's very likely there won't be medical training for all kinds of medical schools in Alabama, and what the long-term implications are of just making it that much harder. So that would be my suggestion.
Well, Harry, thank you so much for sitting down with us and breaking it down. I suspect we'll need to follow up with you in a mere couple of months to see how this has moved. But for now, thank you so much.
My pleasure. All right, great to talk to you.